What's interesting to me, though, I mean, I've heard it described as, I'm a non-stamp collector, is the equivalent, thing of what it means to be an atheist. But you don't find that many people spending their whole lives telling you why stamp collecting is a complete waste of time and you shouldn't involve it. So it feels like when the people who are the kind of public faces of atheism say, I simply lack a belief, I'm like, well, you spend an awful lot of time talking about that lack of belief. You think heaven is sitting around playing a harp on a cloud for eternity? That would be very boring. If it was one long eternal church service, that would be very boring. That's not what I think heaven is.
I guess for me, it's more you can't have the light without the dark.
Right.
Just to say that you can't just be in a permanent state of ecstasy.
No.
If it was, then it wouldn't mean anything anymore.
Your very critiques of the Old Testament, isn't it terrible what it says about slavery and the subjugation of women and everything else? They are coming from a Christian worldview. The morality you are using to critique the Bible is itself Christian morality, as far as I'm concerned.
Why hello, my fellow apes. Welcome to the Rational Roundtable. Our guest today is Justin Brierley, who's perhaps best known as being the host of the popular radio show and podcast Unbelievable over the years. Justin has spent over a decade engaging with some of the world's leading thinkers on matters of faith, philosophy, and the big questions of life. We are honoured to have him here today to share his insights. Justin, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me on, Steve.
It's going to be a blast.
Yeah.
The main thing we're here to discuss is your new book, and it's titled The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Reconsidering Christianity Again.
That's right.
This suggests a few key propositions. First, the resurgence of theism, and as becomes clear by reading the book, particularly Christianity. And second, that atheism and secularism are in decline. Would you say that that's a fair interpretation of your thesis?
Not exactly. So the way I would put it is that, and I do spell out the statistics in the book, it's clear that in the West, church-going, people who affiliate with Christianity, that is on the decline. That's what all the statistics tell us. And there's no reason to consider that that won't be the case for at least a while to come. That's the direction of the graphs. My thesis, the reason I call it the surprising rebirth of belief in God, is more that I'm seeing what I think are the telltale signs that people are running out of steam on the atheist narrative, the secular narrative about life. And I'm seeing the first signs of what I think is possibly the turning of the tide, and that we might be ready to see that rebirth of belief in God again. And it comes through, as the subtitle of the book says, the fact that I'm seeing the conversations changed. It's no longer these kind of new atheist combative debates. Seems to be a lot more secular thinkers open to the idea of the value of Christianity. And secondly, just admittedly anecdotally, just a lot of stories I'm seeing of adult people embracing Christian faith in quite unlikely circumstances. And again, seeing that actually there seems to be something of a movement going on in that kind of way.
Well, this leads me pretty well to the next question then, and that is, what inspired you to believe in these two propositions so strongly to write the book?
I think what it was that I started my Unbelievable show a number of years ago, really when the new atheism was really picking up a head of steam. So that was a kind of time when obviously you had these spokespeople like Richard Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, Dennett, kind of very publicly critiquing religion, saying God's a delusion, religion is bad for you. And that was the just where the public conversation was. And so we tended to reflect that on the show in terms of the conversations. As I say, what I noticed was that for a whole variety of reasons, for me, over several years, the new atheism as a sort of cultural movement started to run out of steam. I started to see a lot of the central people in it start to kind of basically disagree with each other. There was a lot of controversy, to the point where, atheist conferences were being cancelled because people couldn't stand on the same stage next to each other. And I noticed that the energy of the whole movement, what are those key people doing now? Hardly any of them are actually talking about religion anymore. They're all basically in the culture wars on one side or the other of all the controversial issues that are dividing people today. And it felt to me like the energy of the movement had gone somewhere else. At the same time, I was seeing interesting secular thinkers like Jordan Peterson, like Douglas Murray, like Tom Holland, like Ian McGilchrist, like Louise Perry, who were basically saying, I'm not a Christian, but religion isn't all bad, There's sort of some maybe the new atheists were throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And, even if they haven't become Christians themselves, I've seen quite a few people who have walked through the door they've opened to faith. And that's been an interesting phenomenon. So that's where I would say this rebirth kind of begins for me. And it was because I was noticing the landscape changing, both in the conversations I was having, what was happening in the public sphere, the kind of dwindling of new atheism and the rise of this new conversation. And all of that together felt like, to me, a strong enough thesis to say, there's something going on here.
It sounds like, because I think I know what you're talking about. So if you go to Hitchens era, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, there's a bit of like a debate me kind of feel to it. And it was about, look, Christianity is nonsense. Let's stop pretending that it's not nonsense and let's do away with it. Let's move forward. Let's embrace Enlightenment values. Let's pursue truth for its own sake and stop tying ourselves to these relics of our past.
Yeah.
And yet the story and the interactions have very much changed since there.
Yeah.
Then at least, where you've had it so that those that were most infused with energy have like delved into politics, which has fractured the movement, if you will. It's something that you speak about in chapters 1 and 2, including stories about myself.
Yes, yeah, you feature in the book.
I mentioned near Douglas Murray. Whereas those that have stayed and have paid and still play a part in the conversation, they've went more of a philosophical route, and consequently there's a bit more of a dialogue and an exchange, and if you will, an appreciation for Christianity did bring in the past and for what it still does very successfully and how we can work with it. It sounds like those secular thinkers that you mentioned, they're not, is it correct to say that they're not necessarily Christian themselves, but they're more cultural Christians? So is that, by your eyes, a way that you can not throw the baby out of the bathwater? Yeah,
I think that's true. I think a lot of them are kind of saying, I don't subscribe to the supernatural beliefs, but, as Douglas Murray says himself, he describes himself as a Christian atheist, which is, it sounds, like a contradiction in terms, but you know what he means. And then, likewise, Tom Holland, has talked about the fact that he realized through his study of the ancient world and the values he actually holds as a Western person that in almost every way I am a Christian, he said. Now, does that mean he literally believes in the resurrection of the Son of God? I don't know. But they're all on, different places, I think, on their personal kind of journey of whether they are or closer or further away from Christian faith. But what they're doing is, I think they are sort of saying, well, look, Christianity has given us an awful lot. Let's take that seriously. And they're asking interesting questions about what we do in the absence of the Christian story, because I think a lot of them are noticing that society hasn't particularly got a lot better in the wake of a kind of let's all subscribe to science and reason kind of message that was sort of at the core of the new atheism. Maybe some people benefited from that, but a lot of them are saying, and I'm saying in the book as well, that you just can't get rid of the religious instinct that easily. It pops up in a different form, basically. And that's what I think a lot of the culture wars are actually about. So one story I tell in the book is Peter Boghossian, who you're probably familiar with, an atheist philosopher who was at Portland State University. And back in the day, I had him on my show when he'd just written his book, A Manual for Creating Atheists. Exactly what it is, it says on the tin. It's like a set of strategies for arguing people out of their faith. And he came on very much in that new atheist mode for this debate. But 4 years later, in 2018, I got in touch with him about seeing if we could set up a debate in Portland where I was going to be for a on-stage thing with a Christian. And he sent me a very kind, email, but with a very different tone to what I'd experienced previously. He said, I'm not that interested anymore in debating Christians, Justin. In fact, I see a lot of Christians as more my allies than my foes these days. He said, I'm turning my attention elsewhere. And what it turned out he was turning his attention to was the kind of the stuff around grievance studies and things, where he did this whole academic hoax with two of his colleagues calling out, various aspects of the fact that, sexism and patriarchy and privilege was being put at the center of every discipline. And so it was just interesting to see, even though he hadn't become a Christian by any stretch, but his attitude towards people of faith had changed quite remarkably. And that for me was one little example of the way that this was all changing. And for me, that was quite significant.
Yeah, no, just before I move on to the next question, when you said about Douglas Murray referring to himself as a Christian atheist, reminds me of that story of Christopher Hitchens in Ireland. And then he was asked, you a Catholic or you're Protestant? You said, oh, I'm an atheist. And you go, yeah, but are you a Protestant atheist or a
Catholic atheist? Exactly.
I guess like when it comes to, say, Jewish faith and Jewish people, you can have this position where you're like, yeah, I don't believe any of it, but I like the practices and, I recognize that it's been part of my culture and I implement it. But no, I don't think it's real. And that could be something that's developing in the West when it comes to an appreciation with Christianity. I can understand that myself as someone that may or may not be in that new atheist bracket.
Yeah.
But I will move to the next question in the interest of time.
Yeah.
So before we delve in too deep, could you just clarify what you mean by atheism in the context of your book? How do you differentiate it from agnosticism and other forms of non-belief?
So I fully acknowledge that there's a lot of overlap between these terms. So I think you get some strong atheists who say, I definitely think there is no God. And you get other atheists who kind of prefer to term it as, I just don't have a belief in God. That for me is a sort of an agnostic position in a sense. You haven't kind of made a definite declaration one way or the other in a sense. But basically, I mean, I don't tend to dwell too much on the specific definitions because I think I quite often use secular, atheist, agnostic kind of all in the same breath to say people who just don't really think about God much almost a lot of the time, people who have decided that God probably doesn't exist. That would be my kind of working definition. Yeah.
So if you're going to take the probably don't exist, would that mean that you would accept lack theism as an atheism position? They would count as atheists in your book?
Yeah, I think the problem for me always, with this debate over, is it just I lack a belief in God, is, well, that would make rocks atheists and babies atheists. And that doesn't seem to, most people, when they say I'm an atheist, it feels to me like they're making a bit more of a positive statement about their lack of belief.
I see what I mean. Let's push back slightly on that. Saying that someone has a lack of belief in something presupposes that they could believe it in the first place.
Yes.
And rocks wouldn't fall into that category. So you could do a bit of work like this to be able to describe, that kind of position. I guess like if I was to say to you, Justin, do you believe in reincarnation? You might say, look, I haven't really studied it because frankly, it's not part of my ontology, my worldview. However, I'm going to tell you that no, I don't really believe in it, but because I haven't done my research, because I frankly don't care, I can only give you a lack of belief. I can't give you a positive position.
Well, that's fine.
And that's like
and if someone wants to say that's how I define as an atheist, that's fine at one level. I think that the issue is that for me, sometimes it's semantics, and it feels like, okay, well, if you say I lack belief in God, for some people that means I don't believe in God, which is a positive belief that I believe that God does not exist. I think sometimes, it's sort of like, well, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But if you want to tell me it's about a lack of belief, I'm not going to.
Well, for myself, about that. I just base it on the conversation. So I'm talking in a philosophical sense. I would say, yes, I actively believe there are no gods.
Yeah.
I'd fall into like a naturalist view. But the reason I can do this is because I've studied enough, I've thought about it enough, whereas I would wager that most atheists just get on and live their life. Like that famous campaign says that
there's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life.
That's it.
What's interesting to me though, I mean, I've heard it described as, I'm a non-stamp collector, is the equivalent, thing of what it means to be an atheist. But you don't find that many people spending their whole lives telling you why stamp collecting is a complete waste of time and you shouldn't involve it. So it feels like when the people who are the kind of public faces of atheism say, I simply lack a belief, I'm like, well, you spend an awful lot of time talking about that lack of belief.
So maybe I could put some flesh on those bones. If we lived in a world where people that did collect stamps were violating my rights, I would campaign.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not stamp collector.
Yeah.
And the reason why these atheist campaigns go forward by my lights, and certainly why I'm part of a lot of them, is because you get this trespass of it's not good enough for you to have your religious toys and just keep them to yourself. You essentially want to force it on others. You want to bring it into schools. You want to not have separation of church and state. I assure you, if stamp collectors started doing that, we would have and hopefully you'd join me in the non-stamp collecting.
I would be marching with you against the stamp collectors.
Exactly, I hope so.
Anyway.
All right, so next question. You've made reference to a specific type of atheism in your book, and that is new atheism. Do you mind giving me a definition of what you mean by new atheism and how it differs from old atheism?
Yeah, I think probably it was just a term that I think a journalist came up with to kind of describe a bit of a loose collective of people and ideas. But essentially, it was a form of more, you could argue, dogmatic, aggressive, sort of loud atheism that was willing to, that took the form of a number of best-selling books that were written at the time, The God Delusion, God is Not Great, and so on. And that kind of, morphed into a sort of online movement of people who were kind of, very anti-religious, arguably. The tone of it was kind of more mocking, more willing to kind of make fun and poke fun and sort of that sort of thing. It had, a manifestation in a number of conferences and rallies and even that bus campaign. I'd say that was all part of this loose thing that came to be known as the New Atheism. New because it was, it's not that the atheists necessarily believed radically different things to atheists of old. It's just they were more kind of forward and out there and in the public and, generating headlines about this particular type of non-belief.
See what you mean? Do you think 9/11 and...
Yeah, I think that was very significant. So some of the kind of, the origins of it, I think 9/11 made a huge difference. I think Sam Harris has said very explicitly that that's why he started to write and talk about religion and why it was bad for people. So that made a difference. I think equally at the time that it was sort of on the ascendancy, there was the issue of whether intelligent design should be taught in schools. That was going on in the US. I think that kind of generated, again, a lot of sense of, no, we need to protect science and reason. Yeah. And there were concerns, other concerns flying around. So I think all of that, plus actually, I think that the kind of the coming of age of the internet and, early forms of social media and blogging and so on gave the opportunity for a lot of different people sort of spread out to actually come together in one way. And that was part of the driver of the movement too.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I've got my own thoughts on it, but I'm not in the interview.
That's all right.
But no, thank you for clarifying that. So my interpretation from your book and what you're saying now tells me that this definition of atheism, again, there's more from your book, particularly the first chapter, you're defining it in a way that correlates with what's known as woke. So essentially, it's a progressive political movement that has, ironically, little to do with atheism and lots to do with social justice. Do you think that's a fair estimation?
Well, what I tried to do in the first chapter is explain the way in which I think the New Atheism kind of broke into different factions, actually, some of which did go in that direction you've described, the people who wanted to kind of take the movement in the what some people called atheism plus. So atheism plus a commitment to, feminism, LGBT rights, and everything else. So there was that. But there was this very strong movement against that from other quarters of the movement where they said, we don't need all this additional stuff. We don't need all this political correctness. We just need to have science and reason and free thinking, and don't load us with all this additional stuff. So that's where I would say it did like split, and you had a lot of fallout from that. If anyone remembers it, there was a thing that I think was kind of the catalyst for a lot of this was Elevatorgate back in 2011, when Rebecca Watson was propositioned in a elevator, early in the morning after an atheist conference where she'd just been speaking about the problem of misogyny and sexism in the atheist movement. And this might have been something and nothing after she blogged about it, but then Richard Dawkins weighed in on a Pharyngular blog, very sarcastically saying, a blog called Dear Muslima, and kind of parodying Rebecca Watson's concerns in comparison to sort of far worse religious situations. That just set light to the whole thing. And it was like, from that moment on, it felt like atheism was kind of, there was a lot of infighting going on. People who wanted it to go in this more progressive direction, others who thought that was terrible. So yeah, it's both in a way. That's why I see.
New atheism would cover those that were just saying, listen, I'm done with religion, stop throwing it onto my lap.
Yeah.
Let's move society forward. But it's also those that said, we're done and we must care about these social justice issues.
Yeah.
And they had an infighting, and this is leading to why you think it's much
but in a sense, I think that all contributed to the unraveling really of the New Atheist movement. So it was almost as it tried to evolve, it suddenly split and sort of, in a sense, it kind of all went to pot.
So with if we say that the term is dying out and the fire behind it is gone, that wouldn't necessarily mean that it failed. So you could say that it succeeded.
It had a purpose for its time, perhaps.
So would you say it succeeded in its push? It correlates very heavily.
Well, what would you say its push was?
Well, so I would say that with its tone being very much not about reason and philosophy. I mean, the philosophy is pretty poor. All four of the about three of them. Dan Dennett's pretty good.
Yeah.
It wasn't about that. It was more about stop making me collect stamps.
Mm-hmm.
It was about stop teaching evolution in schools. How about you stop being nasty to gay people? How about we just stop with you using your religion in a weaponized way to claim jurisdiction over the experience of others? Let's stop this. And in that sense, what we see today, as something you note in your book, is a massive level of irreligiosity among my generation, Gen Z. So if you was to define their goals in that way, even though they're gone, it would follow that they were
it was
extremely successful in their outcome.
So I would argue against this perception that it was really just about separating church and state and religion not sort of trampling on the rights of free thinkers to be who they wanted to be. I think if you look at the books and listen to the lectures, it's clear that they think religion is bad for people and they would like people to stop being religious altogether. And, Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion is what it says. It's an argument against God, basically. Now, at various points, he kind of makes the points you make about the dangers of religion, and everything else. And I'm sure he wants people to have the freedom for religious belief, but he's still making an extended argument against the concept of God altogether. So it's clear that there's a sort of an evangelistic kind of aspect to this, that he wants people to drop their religious beliefs and adopt atheist perspective. So I think that was definitely part of the movement. Did it succeed in that? Well, for me, the problem is it's very hard to distinguish, when we look at those statistics, as I mentioned, church-going, people saying they're Christian is all on the decline and has been for decades. Well before the new atheism got going, that was just the story. Mm-hmm. I think the new atheism might have accelerated it a little bit in the years that it was really active.
It certainly correlates with the statistics, but correlation doesn't.
It does, no. But I just think that was the direction of travel anyway. And the new atheism was kind of a specific sort of, version of it, and so on. Now, but to push back a little bit on whether it created converts to, of non-religious atheistic types. I mean, what's interesting is if you look at the last census in the UK, for the first time, under 50% of people ticked the Christian box.
Yeah.
About 25%, as I understand it, specifically said they don't have any religion. But then if you dig down a bit deeper, how many of those then took the further step of describing what that non-religious thing is? It's only about somewhere between 10 and 12,000 said atheist. And that's out of 22 million who said non-religious. So it's the number of people who, admittedly, it's about how many people were bothered to kind of do the next bit of the survey. But it feels like that's not a lot of people. It's a tiny fraction of people who actually said, I'm a kind of atheist materialist now. So it feels like...
So an atheist is a materialist now.
Well, let's come to that. But what I'm saying is, if we're saying were people converted to a sort of Dawkins type naturalistic view of reality, I don't think it had that effect. I think it made a lot of people skeptical of religion, and possibly made more people think, no, I'm not interested in the whole God question. But it didn't turn people into these sort of rationalistic, science-only sort of naturalists. I think the vast majority of people, the trajectory was always to, I just don't believe in that stuff. I'm agnostic. I'm maybe spiritual, but not religious, that kind of thing. And again, if you dig into the surveys, it's interesting when you do look at the people who say no religion, a certain percentage of them still pray.
Yep. A
certain percentage of them, still do quasi-religious things and seem to have beliefs that don't rule out the supernatural. So again, it's a mixed bag, and new atheism was just one sort of manifestation of it.
It's interesting because we will move on, but I view, say, Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. Their role for me was not, these people really understand philosophy and theology and they're providing cogent critiques. It was rather they were pointing out how absurd some of the views are. So as I'm sure you can appreciate, if you're someone that really doesn't think that Christianity is true, some of the claims that are made are as ridiculous as hearing stories from monkey gods in Hinduism. And I felt like their ridicule and their precision did a very good job of highlighting this, which made people like me go, I want to kind of look into that and see whether or not that could be defended. So it might be that their goal, I don't know what their goal is. You can't psychologize this, but their role at least was to push a lot of people that would have been open to considering these things to the philosophers. And then it turns out when you look at philosophers, they are overwhelmingly atheist. And I'm talking positive atheism. Something like 70% of atheists, people that study epistemology, metaphysics, all of these, topics that tends to be discussed in theology, it just so happens to be that the vast majority of them do not believe in God. They actively, positively believe that there is no God. And I can't help but feel that that might be a cruel joke being played on us by the big guy upstairs. Well, but, we'll find out on that front.
Yeah.
But we'll set aside that topic for now to move on. And what I wanted to ask was, talking of social justice.
Yeah.
Justin, in your book, you mentioned the kerfuffle, if you will, surrounding me
I do.
after my appearance on the Atheist Experience. Why did you choose to include this incident? What significance do you think it holds for your thesis, for your argument?
Well, I just think it was one more example where I at least had a little bit of a personal connection because we knew each other and you'd been on my show and so on. I just thought it was an interesting moment. I could have selected many anecdotes in a way, but that highlighted that the atheist community itself was very divided, still is, about those kinds of issues. And so, as far as I remember it, you can correct me on the details, but, you would put out a video on transgender and sports and that kind of thing. It had a lot of pushback, but you had been invited by Matt Dillahunty to come over to the Atheist Experience and do some recording. You went over there, had a good conversation as far as I'm aware. The issue of transgender didn't come up, but once you'd returned, certain members of that community had objected to the fact he was even featuring you, given, what you had said. And suddenly there was sort of apologies and yes, we shouldn't have done that. And a kind of like, quote unquote cancellation at Stephen Woodford.
Yeah.
But, and then you did, you also clarified your views on transgender. You said, I may have made some mistakes, but here's what I meant. But the whole thing, the fact that, because of that one issue, sort of basically said you were persona non grata because you had aired a controversial perspective on that issue, for me was another example of the way in which atheism was splitting over these, on the one hand, I'm sure you had lots of people saying, I can't believe it. They're being so unfair to Stephen because he's allowed to have his opinion on that and shouldn't make any difference to the other views they discussed. And other people saying it's unsafe to have Stephen Woodford on your show because, what will this do for LGBT? So it was just all of those, hot button social justice issues were again coming to kind of disrupt what might have otherwise been a fairly, normal kind of conversation, in the movement. I think, and I don't know precisely how much those issues fed into Matt Dillahunty eventually leaving the Atheist Experience altogether, but it just felt like these issues were kind of boiling away and suddenly creating problems for the movement and stopping them being able to kind of go in the, in a kind of unified direction.
So you give quite a few other examples in the book, near where you give the example of myself. And I guess this speaks to what you're saying, where there's this split between those that just want to stick with free speech, no matter how painful it might be, even if it's right or wrong, it doesn't matter. And those that are more in a social justice bubble. Yeah. And I recognize that. I think that that's very much happening. And for what it's worth, the reason I think that's happening, in fact, it'd be interesting to see why you think so many people that are interested in social justice land on the atheism front. So why do you think that is, before I give you my own thoughts?
So why is the social justice movement populated by a lot of atheists? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so you're speaking about atheism and the way that there's a split.
Yeah.
And you get some people that are very much talking about free speech, say what you want, and then you get the split, which is very much based on we need to care about feminism, we need to care about transgender rights.
So, I don't claim to have a complete understanding of why individual people have gone in different directions. Why did P.Z. Myers, who on the surface of it looked just like Dawkins, he was like incredibly rude and about religious people and everything else, but he went off in this very kind of pro-woke direction, for want of a better word. And many of his other followers went in a completely opposite direction to him. Now, it's going to be something to do with presumably P.Z. Myers' background, his concerns and everything else. I'm guessing that, one of the key factors in it is kind of perhaps the motivations that people kind of joined in the movement in the first place. If it was a very kind of, I hate what religion has done to gay people kind of motivation, I'm here to kind of fight back on behalf of my brothers and sisters who have been, penalized or persecuted by religion because they're gay, because they're women, because they're whatever. That I could imagine the people in that movement saying, well, if we're going to be atheists, let's be atheism plus, where we're pro women, LGBT, everything else. For those who maybe joined for a different reason, that they just felt like science and reason have been under attack, and we should just, religious, thinking just tends to cloud our judgment and everything else. You can see why they would see what the atheism plus folk were arguing for. Felt to them a lot like another version of religion. It's like, oh, they're just starting to create another mythology over there, and we don't want none of that. We're here just for the science and the reason, thank you very much, and to speak our mind freely without being cancelled. So I think it's probably the reason. My guess would be it's something about the motivations for why people were there in the first place.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I broadly agree. I don't think I'd use terminology like mythology. I would say what happened is lots of people get involved with it because they care about free speech.
Yeah.
Free speech means that people can say things that you don't damn well like, and it's frankly just wrong. And so if you fall on that horn, which for the record is somewhere where I fall, then you've got to swallow that bitter pill. It's no good saying that you're for it, and then when it comes up, going, actually, I'm not. No, you swallow it. That's what free speech is. It doesn't come for nothing. A principle isn't a principle until it costs you. Now pay the price. Whereas on the other side, as you rightfully pointed out, if you were, say, bi, or you were gay, or trans, or any of these minorities, and you lived in a Christianized country, which is very stagnant and unaccepting of you, declares that you're an abomination, that God doesn't see you that way, and that it's wrong to go that way, then your motivations for getting into atheism wouldn't just be, this is obviously nonsense and it's not accounting for my experience or reality. It will also be, we need to fight against this and establish true secular freedom, which evidently is what the United States is meant to be based on, separation of church and state, which I think is why you get an extra flavour of fire when it's there. So I broadly agree with you on that. Very interesting. So you present Christianity in the book as a foundational shaping force of Western civilization. You even go so far as, by my lights, to accuse humanism and other secular movements as borrowing from the Christian world. How do you reconcile this with the emancipation of slaves, women's rights, gay rights, and of course free speech in general, all emerging after Christianity began losing power? Why is it that when Christianity dominated the West for well over 1,000 years, none of these great values surfaced?
Well, I think partly some of those issues you raise are just the fact that sometimes there's a metaphor that Jesus uses about the kingdom of God in the Gospels, and he says it's like yeast working through dough. So you don't see its effects at first, but gradually you see the dough rise, and it takes time. He talks about a mustard seed, which takes time to grow, but eventually kind of gives shade for, all the birds of the air. And I think it's a bit like that. I don't think you immediately see the effects of the Christian Revolution in every sphere, but you do see it gradually percolate out in all kinds of ways. So what I would say is those things you mention, increased equality, emancipation of women, the abolition of slavery, I think they all have their roots in Christianity. I think it's the Christian Revolution that gave the framework for those things to happen. I would say on the slavery front that if you go right back to the genesis of Christianity, the New Testament, it's, as we know, it's not that you won't find a kind of an explicit denunciation of slavery because it just was the de facto thing that existed in the Roman Empire at that time. But nonetheless, you find some pretty amazing things that the first Christians said about slavery. They said, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. It was an incredibly egalitarian statement that Paul was making in that moment. And he wrote letters to a slave owner to take back his slave as a free person. So there were lots of things that were kind of pressing against, that were kind of very radical in their time, the slavery thing. The transatlantic slave trade is a kind of different kettle of fish to some extent, because that was...
Well, Joshua Bowen wouldn't agree on that, but...
well, either way, I think the reality is that it was still Christian abolitionists who led the way to abolish the slave trade, as much as there were people obviously using scriptures to justify owning slaves. To
occur with Enlightenment values coming up. So did Jesus put the seed down? And he went, All right, so I'm going to give you the Bible and, the New Testament. I'm not really going to rectify anything when it comes to those explicit verses saying that you should stone homosexuals. In fact, keep doing it for the next 1,000 years, because this seed will take a while to grow. When it comes to women's rights, I've given you plenty of verses that subordinate them. They have their role. This is down to Genesis and then through and forward. And with slaves, I'm going to give you lots of verses on, they're in the Old Testament, there's some in the New Testament telling you what you can and can't do with your slaves, where you're to get them from. And I'm not going to say anything against that, because it just so happens that I have to plant the seed in such a way so that 1,000 years later, or when Christianity starts losing its power, these will come to fruition.
I would just disagree that it was 1,000 years later when Christianity starts losing its power. And I mean, even at 1,000 years, Christianity had not lost its power. It probably only really lost its power in the last 200 to 300 years.
Yeah. The reason I say 1,000 is because it took a while for it to get into the Roman Empire.
It sort of, to sort of spread out.
It's a blank.
Okay, got you.
Yeah, I'm saying, but all of its dominance.
Yeah. So I would just say that I think the argument you're making is it wasn't Christianity, Justin. It was the Enlightenment that was responsible for these, equality, the dignity of all human beings, and so on. I would just say the Enlightenment came from somewhere. It didn't just pop out of the blue, okay? And it came, and if you read something like Dominion by Tom Holland, he'll do a much better job than me of explaining this, but it came from very specifically Christian roots, the Enlightenment values and so on, that people often assume are the root of these things. It really, if you look at the ancient world, Christianity represented this radical break from the perspectives people had on things like slavery and the value of people. And the way it spread was because it was so different to the other religions and worldviews around it. So I just don't accept the thesis that the Enlightenment kind of was the thing that eventually got, morality on the road and everything else. I think that's a rather simplistic historical analysis of things, because the concept of human rights, yes, its gestation was slow. It took a while, but it was all the pieces were coming together through the medieval time, through lots of things, through the universities that got established on a Christian basis, through the edict of compassion that was there from the beginning of Christianity, in which saw Christians rescuing, abandoned babies from, rubbish tips, because that was the culture of the day, that you could do that. And, that becoming the foundation for the first, orphanages and looking after. It's like there's lots of pieces of the puzzle that I think come together to say we wouldn't be where we are now without that Christian revolution. Now, you could say, it was only once Christianity started losing its power that some of these most recent things came into force. Maybe it is, but I don't think, I think whenever those things do come about, it's not as though you had to kind of supersede lots of Christians. There's always a mixed bag of Christians who are kind of, for some reasons, fighting against it, and some Christians who are supporting it. Personally, I don't think reason, science, rationality alone can give you a grounding for pursuing those kinds of moral principles. I think you have to have something like Christianity. And as Tom Holland made the point in a debate I hosted between him and A.C. Grayling, he said, humanism as a sort of force, it only really exists in the Christian world, the countries with a Christian inheritance. He kind of lifted off a list of the last 50 places where humanist conferences had taken place. And with the one exception of Mumbai, they were all in, Christian heritage countries. And he said, that's not an accident. It just is the fact that Christianity was what birthed humanism, which, so I'm quite persuaded by that argument.
To be transparent, I find the central narrative there of the seeds being planted, the book explicitly endorsing slavery, subordinating women, stoning homosexuals. I genuinely, it's one of the harder part of the mythos.
Well, what I would say is the problem is that if you're reading just sort of straight out of the Old Testament, I can understand why that would all feel so, jarring and everything. What I would encourage you to do is go and see how Jesus speaks to those issues. And what he does say is, you've heard it said, but I say to you, and he kind of sort of reinterprets or recasts a lot of that Old Testament stuff. But the other thing I would say to you, Stephen, and this is a bit controversial again, I know, but, and I said this to you last time we debated this back in 2019, your very critiques of the Old Testament, isn't it terrible what it says about slavery and the subjugation of women and everything else? they are coming from a Christian worldview. The morality you are using to critique the Bible is itself Christian morality, as far as I'm concerned. I had a fascinating interview with a woman who's a convert from atheist China. And she said, she had had this sort of conversion to Christianity since she moved to the UK. And she said, I get so frustrated when I listen to Richard Dawkins railing on the Old Testament God, she said, because if he was an atheist from my country, he wouldn't be making that argument at all, because there's nothing wrong with what the Old Testament God's doing from where I'm from. It's just what happens when powerful people, she said, the only reason he's making that argument is because he's the product of a Christian country. He's a Christian atheist. So, and I find that quite convincing myself that, as much as you might hate the Old Testament, you're critiquing it because the Christian values that the whole of the Christian tradition gave you.
Wow, there's so much to be said. I do appreciate that I could support slavery and be a Christian and be completely against it and be a Christian. I've got the verses to do it. If I want to be against it, love my neighbour. If I want to be for it, there's plenty of verses.
You could, arguably, but I think we'd have a good conversation about why I think your interpretation is off.
For another time on this one, then. So, next question.
Yeah.
The subtitle of your book states that secular thinkers are reconsidering Christianity again. This seems to imply that secularism and Christianity are mutually exclusive. Does this mean that you deem secularism and atheism as the same thing?
So I am using a bit of a shorthand there. I understand that in the very more technical sense, you could argue secular society doesn't necessarily exclude Christianity. I've heard a lot of my secular friends saying all secular society is about is giving a fair platform for everyone to hold the views that they want to use.
Freedom to religion and freedom.
Yeah. But in common parlance, secular also comes to refer to non-religious. So it's the less technical sense and the more common sense that it's used. When you talk about secular society, you tend to be meaning a society in which religion has been sidelined or is fading away and has been replaced with general skepticism or non-belief around. So that's the only reason I do kind of use secularism and atheism sort of interchangeably.
Like utility.
Yeah.
That's good. So it's not that you're saying secular people are all of a sudden going, you know what, I want some of that theocracy. That sounds real good.
I mean, I get it. What's interesting to me is that, the National Secular Society, I'm sure they don't stop Christians signing up. And I think they probably do have Christians who are on board with some of their ideals, but by and large, most of the people I imagine who are paid up members are atheists. And that's probably not a coincidence, because I think there's a sense in which there's a certain sort of animosity towards religion among a lot of quote unquote secularists because of these concerns you've already said about. They feel it's, doing damage to society and you're better off without religion and so on.
Okay. So this next question is, the lead up is going to be a bit lengthy. So just please correct me. You write that the decline of Christianity in the West since the 1950s onward has been well chronicalized. Each new survey reminds us of the downward trend. You also fully acknowledge a disbelief in Christianity correlates with generations. You write, meanwhile, 3 in 10 US adults identify as nuns, people who describe themselves as having no religious affiliation. That figure leaps to almost half among millennials, born 1980 to 1996, and Gen Z, born 1997 to 2012. However, you maintain that Christianity is on the rise because religious people tend to have more children than their secular counterparts. My question is, how can you reconcile these seemingly contradictory trends? How can Christianity be going up because Christians have more children, and yet each new generation reports higher rates of irreligiosity?
So, I hope perhaps I haven't spelled it out clearly enough in the book, but all I'm simply doing there is saying it depends where you put your magnifying glass. So in the West, by and large, America, Europe, Australia, Canada, whatever, the downward trend, that's where it's happening, basically. More so, to be very specific, the statistic you quote about nuns and Gen Z millennials, that's from Pew Research in the USA. Okay. But that's not the global picture. And that's where I say, in fact, on a global level, what the research actually says is that while atheism or non-belief, the nuns are increasing in the West, as a proportion of the global population, atheism is becoming a smaller proportion of the global population because there's lots of religious people around the world who aren't in the West, and they're having more kids. and they're raising it. So basically, it's that as a proportion of the global population, atheism is actually decreasing, ironically, even as it's increasing specifically in the West.
So with the US, Christians, if I'm not mistaken, do have more children than their secular counterparts.
Probably. I don't know for sure.
Worth us checking that out. But in any case, you would be willing to accept that it doesn't matter. The children are still becoming more atheistic in USA.
Yes, so that may well be the case. I think actually that there are good surveys out there show that the stickiness of religion is not nearly what it is in the West as it is in other parts of the world. Yeah.
My theory on that, and the evidence bores this out pretty well. So someone said to me the other day, they said, what would I have to do to make you religious? And I said, it's actually really easy. You would want to make it so that I don't have access to information, and you would want to make it so that my level of income drops. That's just the gateway to heaven. That's how you get in. So what I'm saying here is that the correlation between people having irreligiosity very much goes one-on-one with GPD, with money.
Right.
Is that an insight that you would subscribe on, or?
Well, again, I think there's a correlation-causation thing that we need to just be aware of. So you could say the more educated people are, the more prosperous a culture is, the less likely it is to be religious. And you might say, therefore, it shows that, education makes people, less likely to believe in God. Something like that. Yeah, or whatever. But there's another explanation, just off the top of my head. It could be that our material, more prosperous culture makes people less reliant on the idea of God. They they're sort of, I don't need God. I'm happy with my life. And in countries and places where life is tougher, there's a kind of sense of, no, I'm going to turn to God. I'm going to pray more. So it could be that's the causation, rather than sort of education takes people. So I'm just saying, I agree. Yep, that's the picture. The interpretation might
exactly. The Bible warns about leaning on material wealth, and that it's about spirituality. So that would also tie into that. It's like maybe they're becoming too materialistic, and that's why.
And at a local level, I'd say, the fact is, I know very intelligent atheists and very intelligent Christians. So on a case by case basis, it's not that education, intelligence, is the only factor at play here.
It's a major factor, though, isn't it?
Well, is it? I mean, as I say, the problem is there's so many other factors it could be down to.
Because, in your book, you reference most of the people that you give are anecdotal, but the statistics is the thing that if I was to issue a big criticism, it'd be that's the thing that I felt was lacking slightly. So, with it being the case that most philosophers have a very, very high level of atheism. Same is true of elite scientists. That's got to count as pretty decent evidence that education is linked to.
Well, I would say it counts as evidence that we're living in a particular cultural moment in the West. So if you went back 300 years, it would turn out that most scientists are Christians and most philosophers believe in God. Okay, as and we know that the scientific revolution was basically started by Christians. Now, the question is, did the science and the education, as it progressed, sort of convince all these people to drop their religious beliefs? I think that's a bit of a simplistic assumption about what happened. I think we moved into, for all kinds of reasons, a more secular mode of thinking about everything, a more kind of religion, in a sense, got supplanted by a lot of other things that people were using to make sense of their life. I don't know that it was particularly about education per se. I just think, because I think the vast majority of people, if you ask them why they don't believe in God, they wouldn't say, because someone gave me a really good argument that God doesn't exist, it's like I'm more educated now. They'd just say, I've never had any reason to believe in God because I live in such a secular culture. I live in a culture where it's never really been raised for me. It's never been a serious proposition.
Yeah. I mean, because I speak to a lot of atheists that converted from Christian faith in the US and in the UK, and almost all of them report that they just found that there wasn't good answers that would be in.
Fair enough, and that may be the case for a lot of.
Was the revelation not actually certain things that we found about the universe? I mean, like if we lived in the times of Socrates and we looked up and we went, look at the wanderers, look at the planets, and we were off the belief that the earth is the center, that actually is really good evidence to think that we're special. And that's actually a node that's going to go towards theism in my book. And I think in the book of a lot of people, if you have no answer to evolution by natural selection, so you have no way of knowing how you got this complexity, that ignorance is definitely going to have some sway on you thinking, okay, maybe I was created.
But as I say, that might be the case for a certain select number of people, that a kind of naturalistic account of how we got here worked better than the biblical account they'd been given. Fair enough. I would argue that the problem there is that often people are given a really bad Christian education in the first place, so it's kind of easy to take that faith away and replace it with something like atheist naturalism. But as I say, the problem is that for the vast majority of people, all those 22 million who tick non-religious, I suspect the theory of natural selection by evolution by natural selection played very little role in the fact they're non-religious. I just think that but I can understand why a good portion of deconverts from Christianity might have gone down that route. The problem is, again, I could provide examples of people for whom science was actually part of their journey towards Christianity, where they say, it turned out there was this fine-tuning of the universe and this cosmological argument, and it all seemed to make sense to me, and I ditched my atheism. It opened the door to faith. Yeah, so it does work in both directions. I just think that education equals people will become more atheistic. That's a bit of an overreach.
I definitely agree with you, but the acknowledgement of the correlation is something that I'm pushing at here.
There's correlation, but as I say, I want to bring in a whole other
It's interesting with the correlation stuff. It's like, on the one hand, I don't think I'm asking too much on that correlation, and yet I feel like you're asking a hell of a lot when you say that Jesus plants a seed for slavery to be, undone so long in the future. But this is why... and
maybe we would both have to look more deeply into the historical process that led to the abolition of slavery. But as I say, I'm going on the fact... I'm sort of reading a lot of interesting historians, Rodney Stark, Tom Holland and others, who are saying, actually, you wouldn't have had the grounds for the modern abolition movement without what preceded it, which specifically came from a Christian inheritance. So... I think Sam Harris mentioned that everyone was Christian at the time. So of course, any movement that comes out of that's going to be Christian in its roots, especially where the first people, the first scientists, they were very much trying to figure out God's world. Yeah. But they were doing it specifically because they believed that there was an orderly universe to examine. Yeah. And that came from their Christian faith. So the scientific revolution
the idea that Christianity is the only religion that thinks that there's an ordered universe is just false.
No, yeah, I'm sure, but it does happen that the scientific revolution took place in the Christian West, So, I mean, Islam did great wonders for mathematics, at one point in their history, but it's just a fact that the scientific revolution was begun by Christian scientists.
And it's just a fact that the transatlantic slave was pioneered by primarily Westerners.
Yes.
And Africans got involved, but we wouldn't use that to say Christianity caused it. You would call me simplistic in that view. So I think
there's a difference. There's a difference. I don't think you can make a historical argument that Christianity sort of instigated the slave trade. I think you can say, I think it's far more obvious that economic interests and so on were the cause of that. I think you can make a far stronger historical argument that the Christian faith of the first
perhaps there's
pioneers, and I've seen the arguments for it, that it wasn't just that everyone was Christian and that was the water they swam in, it was that the specifics about what they believed made them go and do the science they did.
Do you at least think that it's inconvenient that Leviticus tells you to go and get your slaves from the land around you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, I mean...
But that was a necessary seed.
Well, but put it this way, Stephen, when I read the Bible, I try to read it as a whole. And so when I come across a passage that just is confusing and contradictory and I don't like in the Old Testament, I have the similar kind of reaction to you. I'm like, that doesn't make sense to me. But I'm not reading that passage in isolation. I'm reading it as part of a much bigger story told across the whole of Scripture and culminating in Jesus Christ, which for me does make sense of something. Yeah. It says, I can't get behind everything that's happening in this passage and this time and this place where something that seems to me absurd and immoral is taking place. But at the same time, I do trust in this person, Jesus Christ, who has had the most enormous impact on history and whose words and messages about how to love each other and, to love your enemies, bless those who persecute you, are still the most countercultural messages you can find. And it's through his example that I'm going to interpret and understand those confusing bits of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And in that sense, that I'm a Christian, and the clue is in the name. I follow Christ. I'm not a Levitican. It's not like those are the passages that drive my morality. It's something much bigger than that. So it's just, for me, it's about reading the Bible in an intelligent way and not just sort of taking verses out of context.
I get it. I mean, like, by my experience, there are as many variations of Christianity as there are Christians, because essentially every Christian I know will have like a variant view on something and be pretty damn confident that they've got it right, whereas the next person will have their view. Sometimes there's an area of ambiguity. I just wonder to myself, would an all-powerful, all-loving God have his message be so, I don't know, easy to be so conveniently tailored to the basis of each individual? Maybe that's the miracle of it. But
for me, people have different perspectives on issues because they're human. I think we kind of covered some of this ground when we did our last debate. But my contention is simply that if you're using that as an argument against God, that has to do a lot of heavy lifting. The idea, I know what kind of world God would create, and it would be a world in which all Christians were in perfect harmony.
So much, just like an improbability kind of thing. Like, one of the things that I really appreciate with some of my favorite Christian apologists is they seem to be able to recognize where, yes, this bit's a little bit hard to get. And what I tend not to get from Christians is any kind of give. So, like, rather than saying, yes, it is really a problem in my worldview that it took 1,000 years for the seed to hatch. However, I'm convinced because of other reasons, and that mitigates this. I get like this unifying, like, no, there's no problem, all of it's fine. Like, that's just the way that God surely would have wanted.
Well, I hope I'm not giving off that vibe, because I absolutely think Christendom has taken some really wrong turns, and there were things that were justified on the basis of the Bible that are horrendous. And for me, all of that is true. The church itself is a broken, flawed institution, and it always has been in its history. It's not, but at the same time, it's not a surprise to me, because we're human and we're flawed. And my faith isn't in individual Christians or the church. It's in Jesus Christ, who I do think, has something special about him. And there is a reason why his influence continues to endure to the present day. So I guess I'm just saying, since we don't disagree as much as you think we do on this, I acknowledge that there's a lot of messiness. There's a lot of stuff going on. I just don't think it clearly points away from God. I just think it suggests that God is able to work through all that messiness because he's working with humans who he's given freedom, agency, and we tend to, mess it up and stuff it up quite a lot.
Well, thank you for the answer. Okay, we're nearing the end.
I have.
You conclude your book with a hopeful note for Christianity, stating rebirth has happened before and it can happen again. What gives you this hope, and what do you think needs to happen for this rebirth to fully actualize? So,
one of the things that sort of prompted the title of the book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and for the camera, in case it can be seen, there's a sort of tide coming in image on the front of the book.
Nice cover.
It was actually a conversation with Douglas Murray, and we were having this conversation about him being this sort of Christian atheist influenced by the Christian worldview, but doesn't buy it at a supernatural level. And he said, the funny thing is though, Justin, a number of my people I quite respect, thinking intelligent people have converted to Christianity as adults. And I find that an interesting phenomenon. And I was like, okay. And then he said, I suppose it's like that poem. So there's this famous poem by Matthew Arnold, the Victorian poet, called Dover Beach, in which it talks about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. It was this kind of ode to the certainties of a bygone era going out with the scientific revolution, with, everything that was happening in the Victorian era. And he equated it to the sea of faith going out on culture. And that's only accelerated, in 150 years. But then Douglas Murray said something interesting. He said, but, the sea of faith could come back in again. That's the point of tides. And it made me think, well, actually, yes. And I think you do see Christianity kind of dying off in some respects and then being reborn again, in some new way across cultures frequently. It was G.K. Chesterton, I think, who said Christianity has always had a habit of dying and rising again, and that's because it has a God who knew his way out of the grave. It's a sort of, there's a sense in which there's a constant rebirth and reforming of Christianity. And we might be in one of those periods. And it just struck me that maybe we're reaching the tail end of the kind of the secularist narrative, the kind of the atheist narrative. And people are so almost exhausted by it, because I don't think it has ultimately answered their ultimate questions about meaning and purpose Definitely and identity, not, that they're ready to hear the Christian story again. And that's why I say what's significant to me about these secular thinkers who are now saying, hey, like the Jordan Petersons and Tom Hollands and Douglas Murrays, hey, maybe this religion stuff isn't all bad. Maybe we need something like a religious story to make sense of life. I think they're kind of prophets from outside the church in a way, saying maybe this is the time when there's going to be an opportunity for the church to welcome new people who are looking for that identity and purpose, because the materialist postmodern kind of story has kind of run out of steam for them. So it's this sense that, yeah, I do think it's an optimistic thesis. Arguably, it might not go in this direction, but I think we're seeing the telltale signs that we might see, yes, this rebirth of belief in God as people kind of open up to the idea it could be true again.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. There's certainly a change in these tides, if you will, to continue with that. This certainly is a change in tides, where it once would have been mocking religion is something that people...
It's kind of gone out of fashion a bit, hasn't it? It's a bit passé.
Yeah, absolutely. I should have lived 12 years ago. Whereas now it's more about, no, we need to really respect this. Whereas I have to admit, my mind's in like, I ain't going to respect certain views.
Sure.
And that actually leads me to a question I'd like to ask you that pertains to Christianity, but it deviates slightly from the book. If you'd be so kind to indulge me, I'd like to ask you a question that's more about Christianity.
Sure.
Do you think that I'm going to hell?
I don't ever judge whether someone is in or out in that sense.
Of course, but that's not my question.
Do I think you're going to hell?
From all of the propositions that you understand with Christianity, with heaven, hell, judgment, I'm asking, are you convinced that I fit the portfolio of someone that's going to hell? Not whether or not you think, I'm not asking you to judge at this point.
Okay.
I'm asking you, do you think that I fit the criteria of I will be going to hell?
No, I guess I'll say that, because, well, you're asking me to sort of say, do people like Stephen go to hell? Is that what you're asking me to say?
Well, you only know me so much.
Yeah.
So, of course, you can only put a judgment based on an inference of what you see, what you've spoken to in person and what you've seen online. Yeah. However, you have this clear understanding of what heaven and hell is.
Yeah.
And I assume you believe in hell.
I might not believe in hell in quite the same way you're thinking of it. So, and I spelled this out in my first book, that I actually hold to something that's sometimes called annihilationism.
Yes.
So it's the view that actually there isn't some everlasting conscious torment that awaits people who reject God, but that essentially they go out of existence because they don't want the source of life. God's not going to force them to live in his presence forever. Yeah. So it's kind of, it's an end. So, which is actually not different to probably what you think will happen to all of us anyway.
It's what I think will happen to all of us. But by my lights, I find annihilationism doesn't really get away from the issues that are levied at eternal torment. At the end of the day, if you've got an all-powerful, all-loving God, you can pick up Molinism and you can have a consideration here. It seems to me that an all-powerful, all-loving God would only create beings that do actually ultimately want to be with him. Because creating people for, a finite amount of time for annihilation, it just seems to be not a very palatable view. But if you believe in annihilationism, you've got...
Well, okay, so firstly, it's helpful to clarify what I think hell is, okay? And it's this state of non-existence, effectively, for those who reject God and reject Christ. Are you going to be non-existent? Well, yes, if you reject God and reject Christ and do that, at the moment of seeing God, then I think you will cease to exist. You will be annihilated. There'll be no more Stephen Woodford. So if that counts, then if that's where you're at, If that's who you are,
Well,
then yeah.
Just to follow that up, what does rejecting God mean? Does it mean not being convinced by, say, Jesus' resurrection? Like, could I get to heaven, but still go, look, I'm still convinced by Hume that resurrection probably isn't believable.
Well, you might find me, a bit of a woolly liberal on this one, Stephen, but I'm very loath to make judgments on what people say they believe, okay? Because it's one thing to say you believe, it says in the book of James, the demons acknowledge Jesus as Christ and tremble. Just believing something doesn't mean that you are saved. It's something else. There's some kind of foundational trust or in Christ, that Christ is the center of everything. Now, obviously, you're not in that place. Could you come to that place? Maybe one day. Am I going to judge someone who on the surface of it says, I don't believe in God and I've got all these intellectual objections to why, God exists. And I'm going to say, well, God is going to cast that person into annihilation because of these intellectual objections. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think I'm very happy to let God judge every heart because he's a far better job of that than I could ever do. And so if on the day of judgment, when someone is faced with Christ, it's conceivable to be that person may turn around and say, oh, you were the thing I was looking for all the time, not the version of you that I got told in my fundamentalist Baptist church when I was a kid.
Yeah, no, it's interesting.
I just think that it might be a bit more complex than our categories allow for.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is that when Christopher Hitchens died, he actually got to go face to face with God. And I
think we're all going to be raised to go face to face with God.
Okay.
That's actually what Christian theology says. Is that we'll all face a day of judgment.
Yeah.
We'll all be raised, the good and the bad.
Yeah.
And that will be the point at which either our decisions in this life or that moment of being face to face with Christ, in my opinion, that the truth will out, basically. That'll be the moment when we find out where people were, what their hearts are about, because God will know.
So could Christopher Hitchens be in heaven right now?
No, because I don't believe anyone's in heaven.
So no one's there now.
Because what this is taking us a bit into the weeds of a theological discussion, but it's because what the Bible actually describes is a new heaven and new earth, a new creation that we will all be raised into. Yeah. So I think there's a bit of people have in their popular minds a kind of idea of, there's Auntie Mabel's up there in heaven and Christopher Hitchens down there in hell. And but that's not actually what the Bible describes. It's about an end state once time kind of gets wrapped up. So no, I don't believe Christopher Hitchens is in hell, but I believe that if on that day of judgment Christopher Hitchens refuses to bow his knee to God and says, "You're just another North Korean dictator," God's not going to force Christopher Hitchens to stay in his presence.
That's great. So that implies that he and me, we're going to believe in God. So seeing him will
I think ultimately everyone will know that God exists.
You make a judgment of your own judgment, if you will, of whether or not you want to be beside this maximal being. So really, that's really interesting. So that means that really, at some point, no atheist will exist.
Yeah, I actually think that.
Oh, yeah, cool.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good way of putting it. I think because it says in the scripture, one day every knee will bow. That means atheist knees will bow. The question for me is, in a sense, it's but not every knee will want to bow in that sense. And it's going to be sort of, for those who don't, then it's the way C.S. Lewis put it is he said, it's not that God sends people to hell, it's that people choose hell for themselves. They choose that state because they would rather have that than to be in the presence of God. And for me, that goes way beyond, because you might think, well, hey, if everyone's going to see God, then of course all the atheists are going to say, oh, yeah, sorry about the whole atheism thing. Yeah, choose you. That's fine. What are they actually choosing, though? Because again, the popular conception of heaven is kind of a nice place where you play golf for eternity and it's like earth but better. And why wouldn't atheists choose that if God turned out to be true? But I don't think that's what heaven is. Yeah. It's a place, it's called the kingdom of heaven for a reason. It's got a king, and that king is Jesus. And if you don't want everything that Jesus represents in his kingdom, then you're not going to want to be part of it. So that's why I think in that sense, God says, "Thy will be done" to people who don't want Him. The people who don't want God will,
Very interesting when it comes to the concept of living forever. It's like the more I think about it, the more I actually think that wouldn't be a good thing. So I might fit this little category of, it's not so much rejecting a God or not being convinced. It's just, I think that it seems quite plausible to me that living forever would be horrendous.
Why? What would be so bad about living forever?
My intuition speaks to, and my experience with life is just, as time goes on, like, can you imagine having the same conversation 1,000,000 times over?
Mm-hmm.
If you repeated it forever and ever and ever, I don't know, man. It becomes,
I'd agree with
quite
you.
a bit less.
And that's kind of, and I'd agree with you if what heaven is, what that new creation is just this life going on forever. We get bored in a finite amount of life, let alone an infinite amount. The vision I had that is painted in Scripture of heaven is a place where there is no, the boredom doesn't exist. It's like it's constant exploration, adventure, discovery. It's like so. I just think you've probably got the wrong picture. If you think heaven is sitting around playing a harp on a cloud for eternity, that would be very boring. If it was one long eternal church service, that would be very boring. That's not what I think heaven is.
I guess for me, it's more you can't have the light without the dark.
Right.
Just to say that you can't just be in a permanent state of ecstasy.
No.
If it was, then it wouldn't mean anything anymore.
Yeah.
So the point is that you always need this roundabout that we do actually experience in life, which is ups and downs. Yeah. But thank you very much for indulging me on that. Right. Do you have something else to say?
No, I was going to say, again, just because I love talking about this stuff, I don't think heaven is a place where there will be no challenges. I think we'll still have to learn.
Yep.
We'll have the delight of painting a beautiful work of art, and it took effort and skill and everything. I don't think any of the things that make us human will be taken away from us in that state. It's just they'll be perfected. They'll be the way they're meant to be. It's a kind of, so for me, it's like, don't think of heaven as just this life carrying on forever. It's all the best things about this life, the things that make us fully human, perfected, made perfect, and glorious in a way that we probably can't imagine now. But that is something that I can't demonstrate to you objectively. It's just my vision of what it is.
But it is a lovely note to end on. So thank you very much for joining me
on it, Steve.
Oh yeah, I need to come on over. As long as I get a harp. So to sign off, where can people find your fine book?
Oh, that's very kind. The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. It's you can pre-order it right now at justinbrierley.com. You can even get a signed copy there if you want to.
Lovely.
That's the easiest place to send people. My website, justinbrierley.com.
Amazing. I will leave a link below for everybody. Thank you, Justin. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I want to just say I love your stuff, Stephen. I think you're one of my favourite atheists to talk to.
Oh, you're one of my
so thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.